Welcome back for the second hour of KTN News Center. So now we want to talk about the country's debt. So the government plans to increase its debt ceiling from the current 9 trillion shillings to 12 trillion shillings in a bid to help the National Treasury borrow more. Now this comes as the country explores options to finance the 2021-2022 fiscal budget after being hit by revenue shortfalls largely occasioned by the coronavirus pandemic. What does this mean? KTN business reporter Brenda Kerubo explains.
As of August 2020, the stock of Kenya's public debt stood at 7.06 trillion shillings. This, together with committed and disbursed debt of 1.35 trillion shillings, translates to a total public debt of 8.41 trillion shillings, which loosely translates to an equivalent of the government being able to build 14 brand new Nairobi expressways. The Public Finance Management Act sets the public debt ceiling at 9 trillion shillings. National Treasury has submitted a proposal to the National Assembly to amend the Public Finance Management Act to create room for more borrowing.
It's a delicate balance. And that's why we say we are not shy from borrowing. For us to continue now upscaling expenditure, growth, employment, and making sure that we work through this challenging time, sitting around is not a solution. That's why we said we are going to borrow concessionally from the World Bank, from IMF, from other multilateral agencies, including even African Development Bank.
Tax collections have continued to plummet due to the reduced economic activity, which has further been worsened by job losses. The interventions measures to give businesses and salaried Kenyan tax breaks further saw the taxman experience a huge revenue shortfall. Collections in the 3 months to September dropped 15% to 317.6 billion shillings. At the same time, in the current financial year, 2020-2021, debt servicing payments for both domestic and external debt amount to 904.7 billion shillings. That is 47% of total government revenue.
Some of all these created a huge gap in our budget. We had to forego 172 billion Kenyan shilling as a result of those measures. Reduction of the VAT, reduction of the income tax, exemptions of payment taxes from anyone earning 24,000 and below, among very many others. We had to have all in this. So that's how we've been struggling.
The government is currently discussing a $2.3 billion lending program with the International Monetary Fund. It is also having talks with the World Bank for the provision of additional budgetary support loan. Brenda Kerubo, KTN News.
All right. Thank you, Brenda Kerubo, for that report, which leads us to a discussion this morning with the country manager of the International Budget Partnership, Dr. Abraham Rugo, who's joining us via Zoom. Thank you so much, Dr. Rugo, for talking to us here on KTN News Center. So kindly paint for us a picture where we are as a country in terms of our debt.
Thank you so much, Brenda, and thank you for this discussion. Now, I think it's important for me to start from the very beginning that public debt is, it's a critical aspect of our public finance, just like even at household level. Accruing debt is part of just your day-to-day running. And the essence of it is that because you have certain commitments, certain obligations that the citizens expect government to perform, and the revenue that you collect cannot meet all the expenditure requirements, then you borrow some money to invest in certain aspects that definitely will give you, not definitely, but should give you a certain return on investment. And therefore, then later on, then you can be able to use the money that you basically make back, whether you invest in education, where the return on investment is skilled laborers who are able to participate in the economy, or in infrastructure, where then you are improving the mechanisms of doing business, and therefore you have higher return. Or is it in production, where then you have higher exports going out, and therefore you are making more foreign currency. So debt becomes an important aspect of plugging what we call deficit, or basically the gap between how much you earn and how much you're spending. the challenge comes in when two fundamental challenges are not addressed. The first one is when your borrowing is not necessarily being invested in spaces where there is return on investment. In other words, basically you're just spending your money without any hope that you will recoup it later. But secondly, is when the amount you're spending to service or to repay your debt crowds out other critical expenses, as has become the case right now. So as you ask, where are we as a country? I think the picture that you have painted earlier is a critical one, and I think also the picture that the Cabinet Secretary for the National Treasury has presented is correct. What has happened over the last about 6-7 years is that we have basically borrowed quite a bit, quite a lot, rising from about 1.5 trillion to the current borrowing of 7. If you add the guaranteed debt to 8.41 trillion borrowing. Now, when you compare this against how much we are worth, so when we talk about how much we are worth as a country, when I talk about we, I'm talking about the country of Kenya, we are talking about a GDP. We call it GDP in economic terms, gross domestic product, but basically it's the total wealth of the country. It's at about 10 trillion.
All right.
So you're saying that about 89% of your total worth is equivalent to debt. So that debt has grown very fast. But when you look at revenue, in terms of a collection of revenue, our revenue has only increased up to about 1.7 trillion. So in other words, you're saying that you have a debt that is growing at about an average of about 30% annually, but you have a revenue where the money for paying the debt is coming from that is growing at about 14%. Now you see the gap, that how much we are borrowing and how much we are, which translates to how much we are servicing every year. And how much revenue we are collecting. Let me make one last point as a starting. The other thing is that whereas before our country was considered among a least developed country, now our country was rebased in terms of its value, and therefore it moved to a lower middle income country. What that means is that certain concessional arrangements that were available to us before have ceased, but that does not mean that we cannot. What do we mean by concessional? It simply means that we get debt that is at a lower interest rate that is paid over a longer period of time. Here we are talking about 50 years, 75 years, some even 100 years.
All right.
Now we've moved to commercial debt. What it means when you move to commercial debt, or largely commercial debt, is that the repayment period is short, the interest rate is high, and therefore every time we need to pay, we are paying very huge bulks of amounts. Brenda, that is where we are as a country.
All right. I was about to ask you which one is the best for the country. Should we do the commercial debt or not? But then, before you answer that question, Dr. Rugo, let me bring in my colleague Noakip Kemboi, who is at the Central Business District. Noakip Kemboi, good morning. So you're talking about matters debt here in the country. We are worried. We continue borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. People are losing jobs. The taxman cannot even afford, to fully fund the 2021-2022 budget.
Well, good morning to you, Brenda. We are at the National Archives, opened in 1965. Our history is sweet. We shall learn to take it out. But today we're speaking matters national debt, and we have to pick on what the Mwananchi thinks at the end of the day, because in all ways it affects us. Now, I just want to engage some young men, because this country is hugely populated by young people. The question is, are we involving them in the discourse when it comes to matters public management of our funds? This particular gentleman, what is your name, sir?
Hello, I'm Brian Mumanyi.
Okay. Yes. Brian, the issue about debt in the country, you as a young person, first of all, Treasury is saying that we need to borrow. There's no country that cannot live without borrowing, but we need to increase that borrowing in the next financial year. What are your thoughts on this?
I think this increasing of borrowing will affect youths as great as by now as we are affected by this pandemic, you find that majority of the youths are unemployed and most people lost their jobs. So this issue of borrowing and increasing taxes will affect the citizen. Yeah, that is what I think.
Definitely. And again, as we've put it, bottom line, every country borrows at the end of the day. And one of the ways that countries do raise revenue is the issue of taxation. You are a young person, you're trying to, establish the foundations in your life. In the current taxation regime that we have, what are your thoughts on it? The digital service tax, the TOT, that is the turnover tax. What do you think about that?
I think it will affect the youth, whereby you find most youths relied upon the online business. And now the government have got into online business where they say that anybody who is working online should pay tax. You find that because most youths were unemployed, right? You get me? So after now the government have got into online issues relating to youths. So you find that most of the youths will also lose their online jobs because you find the amount of money a youth gets while working online is very minimum, whereby it can sustain the life of that youth. Because the government have failed doing what? Creating job opportunities. I think this issue will affect majority of the youths, including us, because you find youth like me are gonna go to college. After graduating, I get outside here, expectation is to get employment. And the government itself have not created opportunities for getting such employment.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that is one of the issues. But we pointed out the problems, some of the loopholes that the youth are feeling. Now, we talk about solution because, again, Brenda, sometimes they say young people in Kenya always complaining but not offering solutions. So I want to come to this particular gentleman. What is your name, sir?
My name is Dixon.
Dixon, what do you think is the solution to this current issue that we are having in regards to national debt and matters affecting the youth?
Yeah, we must all confess there's a problem. And like you say that all countries borrow, it's not bad to borrow. But you have to do wise borrowing and then wise usage of the same money that you've borrowed. Now, if you look at the last 10 years, a lot of borrowing has been done. At the same time, the same money that has been borrowed, a lot of it has gone to corruption. So what is the need of borrowing? Now a few guys have enriched themselves. We have had even cases and commissions settled for inquiry of corruption. We have even had people confessing carrying money in sacks. But where are they? So why should we borrow?
So the issue of accountability. I know you come from a constituency at the end of the day, and Parliament is the one, are supposed to hold Treasury accountable in terms of how we use our money at the end of the day. Even, raising the debt ceiling, they have to consult Parliament. Do you think our parliamentarians are doing their work of overseeing that Treasury is doing the right thing and the government at large?
We want honesty. One aspect of honesty, I know they know where this money went. Let them show us how much they have returned. And then show us what that money that has been returned has done. Then you can go ahead and tell us about you want to borrow, you want to raise the ceiling. But as long as that one is still under the carpet, this is a joker. It's just jokes.
Okay. So that is the sentiment of the youth. Honesty, accountability, and this is a very huge discussion in the country. The money, when you talk about national debt, yes, we are borrowing. Every country is borrowing. But the question is, are we holding each other accountable? How's the money used? Majority of our money that we borrow goes to recurrent expenditure. So what are the solutions that arrive for government, especially at this difficult time? We've seen the taxes have come back starting 1st January 2021. These are some of the challenges that they think we have to, as much as we're borrowing, accountability is very key and critical for the Kenyan people. Over to you, Brenda.
Now, Kip Kemboi, thank you so much. And it's good to hear the voice of the young people talking about the country's debt, because it's usually say they're the youth of tomorrow, but they like saying they are the youth of today. So let me bring in Dr. Rugo. Dr. Rugo, you know, the young people were talking to my colleague, Noah Kip Kemboi, actually piqued my mind, some of the questions that I'd actually, you know, planned to ask you. That is about expanding the tax bracket. And that is something that the taxman, KRA, has been talking about. We need to expand the tax bracket, bring in the Juakali people. Now we're seeing the government talking about bringing in the online, you know, business as a way of collecting more tax. Do you think as much as the government is expanding that tax bracket, it will still enable the country not to borrow more, to actually reduce our borrowing culture?
Thanks, Brenda. One of the things that is important to always, whenever we talk about taxes, and I've had this discussion, including being able to see how things run in other countries, is that every country has to honor what we call a social contract. A social contract is basically that what I am paying for is what I get. In other words, if I pay my taxes, I shouldn't again go to provide for myself privately what should be publicly provided, whether it's education, whether it's healthcare, whether it's agriculture support services, whether it's security, name them. But what has been happening, and that has been at the core of the difficulty, is that you paying taxes, even the taxes you are paying, there's still a concern that where is the money actually being spent? And why do I still have to make provision, private provision for goods that should be provided publicly? So there is an accountability discussion that is central to taxes, so that we don't have a situation whereby people spend all their time trying to find ways to evade taxes. I do not think that expanding the tax bracket is the most difficult thing. We have systems, we have data. I think every business that is running in this country, at least most of the businesses that run, are registered in some space or another. And therefore, being able to expand that tax bracket is actually possible. But I think it must be accompanied with the ability to be able to showcase what the taxes are being spent, the efficiency, the accountability with which the taxes are being spent. Yes, right. When revenues go up, then it means that then you reduce the pressure that you need to borrow more to be able to provide. You will remember, let me take you back a bit. In 2003, when the NAC government came into place, is when KRA came up with the phrase kulipa ushuru ni kujitegemea. In other words, when we pay our own taxes, we support ourselves, we are able to sustain ourselves. And tax collection shot from just less than 250 billion then. Within a short time, we were nearing $1 trillion. Then it got to some point and stagnated. So I don't think the issue is that when you look at all the economic activity that is going on, that goes on in this country, we should be able to collect a bit more tax.
All right.
But that tax must be spent for the rightful purposes, which is also necessary. And I listen to the young people who are speaking, that's what they are concerned about. And that's what I am concerned about. You know, right. I mean, we pay taxes, but I want to see where those taxes are actually going, so right. that then it gives me a reason right. To even pay more. In other countries, you hear people don't complain so much about how much tax they pay because they see the services which they are paying for being provided.
All right, and you know, Mr. Rugo, I was about to ask you that about other countries, because that's something that has been filed by my colleague Brenda Kerubo. We had the CS for Treasury Kuriatani saying that it is a delicate balance in terms of to borrow and not to borrow. And, you know, he's talking about Kenya expanding that, you know, the borrowing markets. They're looking towards the IMF, the World Bank, and other partners. But then what caught my attention is about the country planning to borrow 2.3 billion shillings. So the question is, what do we expect as a country? Can we live without borrowing? And if we borrow, how much should we borrow? And other countries that have not been on this borrowing spree, how are they surviving? What can we borrow from these countries?
Good. Thanks, Brenda. I think the discussion around borrowing, there's no way you can start a conversation from how much we should borrow, which I think is really has been the critique on the National Treasury. There's very little discussion about what costs are we cutting. because you cannot continue spending as though times are normal. Times are not normal. Times are difficult at household level, at individual level, and that translates, the taxman has shown the numbers, that has translated to how much tax is being collected. Because when you look at it, our biggest portion of tax has been coming from what we call income tax, which combines corporate tax and pay as you earn. In other words, the tax that people pay from the incomes they earn. Now that had about 5 years ago was accounting for about 47% of our total revenue collection. By last year, we were at about 42, 41%. Now, what are the other taxes? The other taxes are dependent on income tax, because the other taxes are excise tax, which is basically about taxes that you pay when you do transactions. The other one is import duty. Who imports cars, who imports stuff from abroad are people who are making an income, and companies that are functioning and performing within the economy. And the last one is VAT, which is a consumption tax, which is also dependent on whether, I buy cooking oil if I have money that I have made from a certain job or certain work that I have done. Now, both import duty and income tax have actually been declining. VAT has grown in proportion, but in terms of the growth, the actual growth year on year has not been very as much as would be. Now we come to COVID times, and what surprised me is that you reduce the taxes, you reduce how much you're planning. So you reduce first the taxes. Of course, that's a gone case, because as of 1st of this month, the taxes are back to normal. You know very well jobs have been lost. Companies are shutting down, but then government expenditure seems to just be within. So when you reduce 200 billion out of a 3 trillion budget, I think the discussion has to start. And every report I have read has talked about something we call fiscal consolidation, basically austerity measures, which is saying, can we spend first on things that are essential and completely critical? Can we suspend certain expenditure for the time being, so that then we are able to break even? Even businesses do stop some of their expansionary plans just to be break even. So I think 2020, 2021, honestly, the budget and the expenditure, both for the national government and the county governments, and generally for government, should have declined by a big portion. Because right now, when you have a deficit for this current financial year of about 900 billion, and all you're expecting to collect is about 1.6 trillion, which is already pushing and looking like it's going to be only about 1.4. You're saying that you only have 500 billion for essential spending. In other words, for spending on anything else, because the rest is going to pay debt. I think, Brenda, that's where my concern is.
All right, and it is a concern about, that every other Kenyan has. You talked about austerity measures, something that Kuriatani talked about, just trying to cut the government spending, both at the county and the national, governments. But then, Daktari, just stay with me. We're coming back with this discussion after the short commercial break I'm taking right now here on KTN News Center. We're talking about our country's debt. Should it continue borrowing or not? And how can we raise our funding for the budget?
This is KTN News.